For as long as I can remember, I've had trouble sleeping, the kind of trouble where you lie awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, feeling like your mind is racing while the rest of the world sleeps. To pass the time, I'd often turn on the TV late at night, keeping the volume low and flipping through the channels. When I moved into a new apartment last summer, my insomnia got worse. I wasn't used to the place yet. The strange creaks and groans, the hum of the refrigerator, the occasional muffled voices of my neighbors. The walls were thin enough that I could hear someone coughing in the unit next to mine. Sometimes I'd hear footsteps echoing in the hallway at odd hours, but when I looked, no one was ever there. It was a lonely place, but it was cheap, and I figured I'd get used to it eventually. One night, unable to sleep, I turned on the TV and started flipping through the channels. There weren't many, just the basic local ones that came with the outdated cable package my landlord provided. Most were boring news programs or reruns of old sitcoms. But as I was scrolling, I landed on channel 26. At first it was just static, black and white snow crackling faintly. I was about to move on when something caught my eye. In the middle of the static, there was movement. Not the random flickers you'd expect, but deliberate shapes forming and dissolving like shadows in a fog. I leaned closer, squinting at the screen. The shapes coalesced into a figure. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was tall and thin, with a gaunt face that seemed stretched too tightly over his skull. His eyes were black voids, and his mouth hung open in a twisted grimace, like he was screaming silently. I felt my stomach drop. I told myself it was just interference, a trick of the light. But then he moved. The man stepped closer, his image growing clearer through the static, and then he did something that sent a jolt of terror through me. He waved. I turned off the TV so quickly I almost dropped the remote. My heart was pounding, my hands shaking. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the blank screen, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. The next day, I convinced myself it had been a hallucination, a product of sleep deprivation and an overactive imagination. I avoided the TV entirely that night, opting to read instead. But the curiosity gnawed at me. By the third night, I couldn't resist. I turned the TV back on and flipped to channel 26. The static was there again, waiting. So was he. This time the man was closer. His face filled the screen, his hollow eyes staring directly into mine. My stomach churned as I realized this wasn't just a random signal or some kind of interference. He was aware of me. Then he spoke. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice distorted, like it was coming through a broken radio. I froze. My hands fumbled for the remote, but it wouldn't work. The TV wouldn't turn off. I tried unplugging the set, but it stayed on, the man's face growing larger, more distorted. "You let me in," he said, his voice louder now. "I'm coming." The screen went black. I stood there in the silence, trembling. For the next few nights, I didn't sleep. I left the TV unplugged, but strange things started happening. I'd wake up to find it plugged back in, the static crackling faintly. My reflection in the screen looked wrong, like it was watching me. Then the knocking started. It was always at 3:13 a.m., 3 sharp knocks on my front door. At first I ignored it, but the sound was impossible to ignore. When I finally worked up the courage to check, no one was ever there. I even asked the building manager if anyone else had complained about late-night disturbances, but he just gave me a blank look and said I was the only one living on this floor. One morning, after another sleepless night, I found a note slipped under my door. The paper was yellowed, the handwriting shaky and uneven, like a child's. It read, "You let me in. I'm already here." That was the breaking point. I packed up whatever I could carry and left the apartment that day. abandoning everything else. I moved to a new city, a new building, and swore off TVs entirely. I told myself it was over. But last night I heard the knocking again. This time it wasn't at the door, it was inside the walls. And then, as I sat frozen in my bed, I heard his voice, faint but clear, whispering from the shadows. "You can't run from me. You let me in."